And then we'll get started. If you have questions, you can put them in the Mumble chat, type them to me or PM to me, something. It'd be great. Yeah, we'll get started at this point. Pino, are you recording? Great. So this is the Keepside Chat with Goblinworks Bob, the man behind the monsters. Bob, what are you working on nowadays? What are you doing at Goblinworks?
So, a lot of what we're doing these days is trying to get a few more escalations put in, put some polish on the existing escalations. And of course, a lot of us are pretty busy right now getting the next patch ready for shipping as soon as we can get that out.
So what's up with EE8? I know it's not exactly your area perfectly, but give us an insight.
So actually, a lot of us help out with the testing on these when they go out. Basically, we just had a few last-minute things that took a while to get finished up, and so that's why it's coming out late. And we don't want to put it up on Zog until it's really ready for everybody to take a look at. But yeah, we're trying out the feuds and stuff like that, making sure that's all working right now. We got a new escalation for you with the Elemental Rift, but that's coming with fresh new monsters, which will be a nice change. And lots of other little tiny fixes scattered throughout.
So there's been a lot of debate on the forums about how long should it be on Zog before you come out in the real time. Any thoughts about kind of making it at least a week for testing with the players? So having it be a week, I mean, obviously that'd be great, but it also turns into kind of a management nightmare of keeping track of builds and making sure that changes go into the right things. The other thing on top of that is that we can only really kind of devote attention to it for so long. So we try to keep it up for, a reasonable number of days if we can. That said, I would also say that a lot of the point is not so much necessarily how long the build is up on Zog as how turbulent its time on Zog is. We really want to make sure that at least the build that goes out will be a build that has been on Zog for a couple of days or at least a day and has been successful while that particular build has been on. Wow, that scares me just a day or two on Zog, though, because we've had some bad luck with patches rolling out. That's definitely true. I would point out that in a lot of the cases where things had problems, it was because of bugs that we wouldn't necessarily even have caught had we been on for a week. They were the kinds of things you only caught with mass numbers of people. I'm thinking in particular of the infamous weekend where everything was full of monsters. That particular bug, actually, we could have had that up for like a week on Zog and it still wouldn't have shown up because we wouldn't have had enough people in one hex fast enough to have it come on. Several of the other bugs in past cases, it's been an issue where the build may even have been on, we may even have had stuff on Zog for several days, but the build that went out was technically actually only on Zog for maybe a few hours or something like that. We made some last minute changes and we thought they were safer than they were. So we try real hard now to at least make sure that every time we change the build, that final one stays up long enough that we feel comfortable it's gone through its paces. We do a lot more smoke testing of each of those builds as well. All right, well that makes me feel a little better. So talk to me about these elementals. I know you got a new escalation coming out. We're going to see just random ones. I hear they're going to be 30 feet tall. What's the deal? Well, they range in size. Some of them are actually smaller than human size. Some of them are, we'll just say for now, much, much larger than human size. Steven's actually the one who set up all of their stats. But so I can't speak, incredibly well on that. But they do use much more, elemental-based attacks. There's a lot more fire and cold type attacks. They also have a lot of resistance to some of those kinds of attacks as well. So it's going to be interesting to try to make sure you've got the right attacks available to you. And in particular, compared to, say, the Moloch cultists who specialize in fire only, the elementals in this particular escalation are very mixed together. So you'll run into all of the different elemental kinds at the same time.
kind of working together. Of course, that also means they sometimes hurt each other, but hopefully they won't attack each other too much.
Can they actually attack each other now?
So there's been a bug off and on that people have seen where if one of the enemies has an area of effect attack and that hurts one of their allies, that they might turn around and attack their ally. We've got some code in there now that makes it so that all of the monsters who are activated together will treat each other as allies and will ignore damage from other ones. But sometimes they don't quite realize they're allies, and so one of them will hurt another one, and the other one will take a little revenge. That tends to happen when they were far apart when they started. So hopefully there won't be much of that.
Can you make it so we don't attack our allies?
That would be nice. Of course, part of the funny thing of that is that, the game is supposed to allow for the possibility that someone's being a traitor. But we definitely like to make it harder to hurt your own allies. And there's also often a healthy debate that goes on here about how much AoE attacks should hurt your friends or what we should do to try to make it harder to hurt your friends. We definitely want to put some UI stuff in there that's going to make it a little more obvious for you when that's going to happen.
So these elementals tier 2?
Pretty much. I would probably say they're a little bit harder than the Morden Spire on average, but only just a little bit.
How about their loot?
So I'm trying to remember exactly their loot. I mean, generally speaking, you find pretty much the same kind of loot throughout. I think these will. I suspect these are ones where Knowledge Planes is going to be pretty big because I think they're outsider-ish. But I'm not actually sure exactly what they're set to drop. I mean, almost everybody drops the usual recipes and stuff like that. And these ones, when you encounter the really large ones, you'll definitely have a chance of maybe some tier 3 recipes. And other expenditures.
Great segue. What about tier 3 escalations?
So we've held off a little bit on the tier 3 escalations up until now because of the fact that it was creating a situation in which it seemed just much too tempting for people to go farming and kiting and all that kind of stuff. So we tried to avoid having the world with too much stuff that people weren't really meant to handle. But I think now at least a fair number of players are starting to reach the point where they can handle a little bit of that. What we'll probably do, as opposed to having a straight out suddenly there's a tier 3 escalation, it'll probably be more of a gradual thing. We'll add something that's a little tougher than the elementals, and then something that's a little tougher than that. So it'll be kind of more like a T2.1 or 2.2, something along those lines. It'll probably be a while before we really want to have escalations out there that consistently drop tier 3 loot.
I don't know. I think some of us are ready for the next challenge.
That's probably true. We'll probably make some of that challenge just in terms of numbers and in terms of having larger groups of the tougher guys at the same time. But yeah, we'll be moving slowly up towards that. I think by this point in time, a lot of you are probably running into the point where it's getting much further up along, being a level 15 fighter or whatever is getting to be slower because of the way that the experience points grow. But on the other hand, you're starting to finally have some of that equipment. So yeah, we have to kind of balance that out. Probably we'll also have to make sure that some of those tougher ones don't launch too many times. But also there's going to have to be a bit of a community thing that goes on to help make sure that when one of those really tough ones appears somewhere where the population isn't really ready for it, that people find their way there and actually help take care of it as well.
So that brings up another good question, which is about the spawn rates and wait until server up or just randomly. Is it 12 to 24 hours? What's going on? Because I heard you shaking your head forlornly last week. What's up with the spawn?
So whenever you kill an escalation, each one of those has a number of hours that it's set to say that that hex should remain infection-free for that long. In particular, so right now in the current build, if you kill a mini escalation, it says don't put another escalation here for 12 hours. If you kill any other escalation, it says don't put another one here for 36 hours. Unfortunately, it looks like every time we come back from downtime, all of the hexes ignore that and just go ahead and reinfect. And that's really causing a big problem with the monster, or with the home hexes in particular, because that means that you get no free time from those practically at all. And it also means that any changes I could make to that, which I've already gone in and done for EE8, I've set the numbers such that the T2 escalations will actually block it off. I believe it's for 72 hours, so 3 straight days when you clear a T2 escalation, and 2 days for a T1, and 24 hours for a mini escalation. But those effects, that change won't really matter if everything just happens right after downtime. On the other hand, the programmers are in fact looking at that bug in hopes that we can get it fixed for EE8, but it really depends on what they find when they look there. A cursory look, they couldn't see anything obvious, so there's a chance they're going to have to do a lot more debugging, and it might not get in until EE9. When that does, though, then you'll get a lot more time free, so you'll have much more of a balance where you can clear one hex and then know that it'll be cleared for 2 or 3 more days. Go clear another one, and really cycle through your nearby hexes with a little more freedom to know that you're not going to just have to clear every single hex every day.
So that's a wait and see sometime soon.
Pretty much.
So, and didn't I see something about you're changing the number of victory tokens that come out, things like that?
Yeah, so originally I had gone ahead and changed the numbers so that the mini escalations gave a little bit less, and the tougher escalations gave a little bit more. Part of that had to do with a bug that was actually making the tougher ones give out less than I'd intended. But we found a way to work around that bug instead of waiting for the code. So I made those changes, but then we debated a little bit more, and one of the problems with the solution I was using was that it meant that when you killed a mini escalation, there was actually a chance you'd get no victory markers. And on the one hand, I had wanted to sort of discourage people from farming the mini escalations, but the flip side of that is we didn't like the fact that it meant that newer players going out and tackling a mini escalation might feel like they weren't really getting anything for having done it. And so what we did is we changed it so that the mini escalations will still do what they did before, which is they give out 1 victory marker to every party member of the killing person. And then the sort of more tier, like if it's a full tier 1, it's going to tend to give somewhere between 1 and 2 to everybody. And if it's a midway up, it's going to give 2 of them to everybody. All the way up to the tougher ones like Morden Spire and now Elemental Rift. Those ones will give a solid 3 victory markers to every person in the party.
Well, that works.
Oh, I should point out, though, that there's a kind of a flip side to that for all of you, which is that the mini escalations, they used to drop in strength by 100 points every single hour, and they're not going to do that anymore. We wanted to, partially that's just because we were going to have them be appearing near Thornkeep on a regular basis, and it felt weird that they were always kind of dropping themselves down to 0. But also with some of the other fixes about the orphan hexes and things like that, it just didn't seem quite as big a deal to let them be a little bit tougher. But it does mean that now you won't be stumbling on nearly finished off mini escalations the way that people were now. I mean, I know that Lisa and I would go out occasionally and we'd run across 2 or 3 hexes that basically all we had to do was go find the boss and kill it and get those victory markers. Now you'll actually have to earn it. Or maybe not you, maybe you'll find that somebody else did it for you, but somebody will have have killed off most of those enemies and brought it down for you. The other thing is that Elemental Rift is an experiment with a new way of doing escalation strength. Currently, all the escalations start out, the typical escalations start out at something like 20% of their strength, and then they build up over time. So if you go in and you tackle them right away, they never really build up and you never really kill off a lot of their interesting monsters. And that creates kind of a situation where some people feel like they really ought to farm it by letting it get up to the high level, so then they can kill off some really tough ones and then pull it back down. And it also just creates kind of a situation in which, let's say you do find one that's 100%, you start fighting it, and then it just gets easier as you're fighting it, and you might find yourself getting bored because it's just not as challenging, not as interesting. So Elemental Rift actually reverses that. It actually starts out at something more like 80% of strength, and as you beat it down, the elementals, essentially the fiction around it is that they stop attacking their neighbors as much because they're dropping in strength, and they start bringing all their tougher monsters back into the hex. So as it's dropping in strength, you're facing tougher and tougher enemies and tougher and tougher events to deal with. So it's going to reward you 3 victory markers when you kill it, but you will have earned that by the time you get it down to that point.
Wow, that sounds really cool. Any thoughts about changing the other ones to follow similar?
That's exactly what we're talking about doing. If this works out, we'll probably, maybe you guys will find some small problems with it, maybe some big problems while it's out there, but we'll kind of use this one as the one. We'll see how it goes, figure out exactly, make sure we get this one right, and then start applying the same logic to as many of the other ones as we can. There's still a few of them that just partially from a fiction standpoint and partially just from a kind of the way the events work, I like it better that way. An example would be Skeletal Uprising. I kind of like the idea that those are ones that, if they come in and if you notice them in time, it never really gets out of hand and you never really have to worry about it. They really are meant to be kind of there's some little problem, and if we deal with it, great. And if we don't, then we're in trouble. So 1 or 2 of them we might leave alone. And I think it's nice to have a few that have kind of a slightly different way of working so that they don't just all feel the same anyway. Hopefully that'll all work out.
I like that. Now, let's talk more about Elemental Uprising. How many hexes is that going to spread to?
So the Elemental Rift one, the new one is going to spread to up to 9 hexes, I believe, at this point. It does spread. It still spreads reasonably slowly, because the other thing is where previously a hex would consider itself infected if it reached about 10% or less of its strength, or its max strength. This new one requires that it gets to something more like 70% before it considers itself infected. So the numbers still work out to the point that it should still take several days before it actually infects anybody.
Yeah, that was kind of the question. If it's starting at 80%, is it going to infect its neighboring square hex tomorrow?
Yeah, hopefully not. I've tested it out, and it looks like the numbers are working right. It should still take just about as long for it to count as infected. On the other hand, though, once it is infected, it is at a very high strength. And so from the moment that it's infected, it's capable of reinforcing its source pretty effectively. It also starts infecting its neighbors just as strongly as the source was originally. But again, even those further out neighbors require hitting a very high level before they'll count. So it'll still take another several days before they get there. It should still be pretty much the same as it is now, where if only 1 or 2 are infected, the reinforcements are not too hard to handle. But if you let a cluster of them get infected, that's when you start feeling the pain, and it'll probably be the same with this.
So we've gone from monster get-in to elemental get-in or something? We may show up one day and just have the entire server covered in elementals instead of bone dancers.
So the bone dancers, for comparison, they were actually set to be capable of infecting 30 hexes. And I'm still considering whether to cut that back. Part of the thing is when I originally sort of figured out that number, I was thinking in terms of them expanding in a fairly straightforward, just one ring of hexes and then another ring of hexes kind of way. And as it turns out, because of the roads and because of being sort of blocked out by other escalations, and occasionally because a particularly tough settlement keeps shoving them in another direction or something like that, what winds up happening is they wind up instead infecting 30 hexes in a weird meandering line, and that gets to be really tough to deal with. Although it does also mean that it's easier when you can deal with their orphan hexes, it's easier to kind of cut them in half so they don't reacquire as quickly and stuff like that. Hopefully the orphan thing has helped with that. But still, 30 compared to 9 should be a huge difference. And if it gets too bad, I'll always look at those numbers and consider cutting it back. But it shouldn't be so much that the world should be taken over with it. There's still at most 4 elemental rift ones running at the same time and taking over 9 hexes each. So even if all 4 of them are running, they're not capable of taking over much more than a single Bone Dancer one is.
Yeah, how would you get rid of the Bone Dancers?
They are kind of a pain. At this point, the best I could probably do is, I can stomp them any time, but that seems a little bit heavy-handed. But I might go in at some point and cut their number down. I was hoping that the orphan hexes thing was gonna get that number down pretty well, and at this point, actually, I don't see as much of them as I used to. So it'd be interesting to hear from people just how much of a problem they still are, or whether it's just bad memories.
My friends at Emerald Lodge and Canis Castrum and a few others have been working very hard to keep them down, but that feels like work.
So they're still hooking up with their sources pretty quickly. Yeah, I should probably look at going ahead and lowering that number down to something more in the 20s range or something like that. That would probably help clear this up quite quickly.
I don't know that anyone in here would be mad if the Bone Dancers started going away.
Understood.
So, how about Ustalabi and Heroes and Legends? Where those are taken out, they come back?
That's a good question. Probably somewhere pretty quick in here they could come back. I need to relook at their outfits. Mike wasn't too happy with the outfits I attached to them originally. But yeah, I think at this point, at the very least, the heroes could probably come back. They're not that much higher, and they don't drop that crazy of loot. But yeah, that's something I should look at for the next build. It's certainly an easy thing for me to add. I just have to change a couple numbers here and there, and then they would suddenly be appearing. I don't have to rebalance anything for them, at least. So I will take a look at those.
Yeah, that would help. By the way, for those of you who do have questions for Bob, if you can just put them in the mobile chat, that'd be great. So how about, talk to me a little bit more about this concept that escalations are going to mess with our holdings and things. And one of the questions people are having is the guards and other things. Will that impact the escalations? Can the guards be fighting them off? I mean, what are your thoughts?
So we haven't really designed it very much at all. It's a good question about whether the amount of resources you put in there, how many guards, how much that would help to fight it off. That's all something that we could certainly look at. We could give the hexes a certain amount of resistance. Of course, you can also take advantage of the guards by luring monsters close to them and stuff like that, but then you miss out on the loot and the kill. So it's kind of a questionable thing. My original thought on it was primarily just that it would be really nice if players had a reason to try to keep the hex clear, so that every time it gets infected, that you would actually, want to get rid of it, not just because you kind of want the loot or that kind of stuff, but that it was good to get rid of it. And so what we've been thinking was that primarily it would do things like lower the amount of bulk resources that you're pulling out of that hex. do some things along those lines. Obviously, it already prevents you from putting the holdings down or putting outposts down and stuff like that. But we'd like to have a longer-term effect on that. We've also talked about potentially even just making it so that it lowers the amount of stuff that you get in the nodes. And potentially that could be very specific. You know, certain types of creatures might like, I don't know, gold or silver or wool or whatever for some reason. And so or the goblins might like to get some of the stuff to make, you know, stately potions with it or something like that. So we've talked a little bit about maybe affecting that kind of stuff. But the idea is mostly just to have it have just enough of an effect that when you see an escalation come into one of your hexes, that you want to deal with it. When there's a hex with an escalation going on in it, and you want to gather stuff there, that you actually feel like you should do something about the escalation there, not just kind of dance around it and try to do that. Although we also hope eventually that we can get a little more mobility in there with the monsters, and then that way, you know, we can do some stuff where if you want to go gather in a hex and it's got an infection in there, that means that you're going to have somebody dealing with the monsters while you're gathering at the same time, because otherwise, they actually do come after you while you're trying to deal with gathering.
That sounds cool. So not short term here that they'll be messing with our settlements or holdings.
Probably not. It's probably a little ways off.
Well, at least that's something we don't have to worry about.
We figured you guys will have enough to worry about at the moment, just trying to make sure you figure out all the intricacies of how much of different bulk resources you should have and all that kind of stuff. We don't want to throw too much at the community at once.
So last week there was some talk about a little bit of rebalancing and, you know, some, I think Lee called it mathing, especially based on population and other things. Have you made any thoughts about that as far as escalations?
So a long time ago, I actually did do one big shift around that, which was the slowing down the speed at which all of these escalations spread and how rapidly they grow over time. And so right now, all of them are actually growing and spreading at about 1/4 of the rate that I'd originally planned. And so my intention is still that when I start to feel like the community is essentially stomping almost every escalation as quickly as it comes up, or, you know, much faster than intended, that what I want to do is basically first cut back the reductions by half, and then again cut them by another half when that seems to be no longer doing the trick. The goal is to make sure that we don't want it to feel like work exactly, but we do want it to feel like there's some pressure to go in and deal with things. I know there's been some requests right now about, you know, changing things around a little bit, because people will say, you know, I go in, we can only really come in one weekend and fight it, and then we come back 1 week later and everything we've done was undone, and it makes us, you know, feel like we can't really deal with this, and so it just feels like every time we do it, we come back and we do the same one. And I definitely understand that feels that way, but at the same time, I know that I've got other parts of the map where everything's cleared and people are dealing with stuff almost instantly. And what we want is that you do feel like it's important to come at them in strength and to deal with them efficiently. So that, you know, if you're not coming at them hard and fast enough, that it does feel a little like some of your progress gets undone. That you really want to look at the situation and go, there's 5,000 points left. We really need to get all 5,000 of those strength points gone, because if we don't do it, you know, then we have to come back later, or then we'll have to start over again to some degree. We don't want that to feel too bad and feel like too much work, but we want that little bit of pressure that makes you think, you know, we really should just try to pull this out for another 20 minutes and finish it off, because otherwise it doesn't work out for us. So in order to do that, I have to get those growth rates somewhat balanced to the population. I'm not sure that the population is there right now, so I haven't been too tempted to raise that up. I think the population right now is more just that some of you guys are ready for tougher monsters, so it's time for me to start, as we're doing with the elementals, it's time to start thinking in terms of adding a few tougher creatures, maybe, like I said, bringing back the Ustalav heroes and legends, but not in such vast numbers that there's stuff on the map that really requires extremely large parties to deal with them in time.
So, but how about a little rebalancing in that? I mean, my friends in the Northwest, man, they've got so many hexes they have to clear out every night. It really is getting to work because they have a lot of home hexes.
Yeah, I think the largest part of that, I still think, is the fact that the downtime thing isn't working. So, like I said, you clear it out and then you're right back at it the very next day doing the same thing, where most of those home hexes, you should be getting at least 2 or 3 days between them. So once we can get that done, we could definitely help. It's tough to say. I think, what I'm kind of hoping to see is to see more companies get out there essentially offering to help, and that some of these settlements that maybe don't have enough numbers will just offer some gear to somebody and say, hey, if you can clear this one out for us this time, we'll give you this, or make more deals and stuff like that. I know that's not necessarily always in the cards, but I think there are a lot of ways that people could find to clear these out in a somewhat, sort of spread the load around a little bit. I also really do think that most of the time, I think some people still are very gun shy about the fact that these escalations got so out of hand before. But at this point, really, I'm fairly certain that if you can clear out, if you just took one day and cleared out one escalation and then cleared out the other escalation, kept bouncing between them, it wouldn't be too bad. Now, I will take that back a little bit if you've got 2 home hexes right near you, because of course it comes back with the same thing and reinforces super quickly. But again, that'll be better when the downtime thing is fixed, because you'll have more time to deal with the orphaned hexes before they come back. But yeah, it's an interesting question what I could do for some of those. If people have very specific issues, particularly if you're finding yourself with, we've got 2 home hexes that operate the following way, I'd be interested to hear what the problems are with those specific ones, because then I might be able to look, directly at those. I can, for example, look at increasing the orphan multiplier for specific escalations, which I don't think would throw the balance off too much on the map as a whole, even if I was only doing it just to correct some problems with certain home hexes. So that would be a possibility. But it'd be good to hear, what the specific problem is so that I can balance for that particular problem.
What's the orphan multiplier, just so we know?
Yeah. For those of you who don't know, so when a hex gets orphaned, because it's not a monster hex, it's one of the wilderness hexes that was infected by the escalation. When the source hex is destroyed, that hex is now considered an orphan. It no longer runs events. It no longer grows in strength. It no longer reinforces. It no longer spreads. It's just the sort of leftover monsters there. But when that happens, the other thing that happens is that we give you 10 times the points every time you kill a monster. So what used to give you 10 or 20 points now gives you 100 to 200 points. So it should take you 1/10 of the time to clear out an orphan that it did before. That was, I think, one of the other big problems with the Bone Dancers originally was all those orphaned hexes, it took a while to clear them out, and then since you couldn't clear them out in time, they pretty quickly got reacquired by another Bone Dancer escalation that happened to start nearby, or even not all that nearby, just somehow connected through a chain of hexes back to that one. But with the multiplier, it seems like people have been clearing out those orphans a lot more quickly.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense now. That's why we can clear other hexes. I just wasn't sure what you were calling the orphan multiplier.
Yeah, that's what that is. And it does mean that given this current state of things, if you have a home hex on your border and you clear it out sometime in the afternoon Pacific time, it's a really good idea to basically tell everybody, hey, use some of your time to attack the orphaned hexes before downtime hits, so that when the escalation comes back the next day, it doesn't have all these ones that it can just immediately reacquire.
That makes sense. Can we just put a rule in that Og can't ever spawn near the university?
Sadly, I can't remember where his home hex. It may very well be quite near that. But it does seem like the university has had him a lot.
That was the old university spot. I hope he stays down there. Let's put it that way.
Yeah, I've heard various reports from people of it seeming like certain escalations come back to the same spots over and over again. There's, to my knowledge, there's nothing in there that should really cause that. Nothing about the order in which they get processed or anything like that should really be a big enough effect to cause that. It's possible, though, that just as a function of the parts of the map that aren't being attended to, locking down all of the other escalations, that maybe it's just, there's only so many escalations left that have a lot of instances that are allowed, Og being one of them. And, wherever you beat him down, he's just fairly likely to come back. But even that, I don't think should be the case. I think there's only roughly 30 to 40 monster hexes and home hexes to put things in, and there's something more like 50 or 60 possible escalations when you put all the instances together. So it should still be pretty varied, but it's probably just one of those unlucky number things.
Yeah, we were having some discussions about that. The question was, is there a ranked ordered list or something along those lines of escalations? Does it fill east to west? I don't know.
It does fill in order, and the fact that they're all filling at downtime would exacerbate the problem. The fact they're filling in order really should barely affect it when those fallow times are all really offset. Then it shouldn't matter at all. But the fact that a bunch of them probably all happen at downtime, there's a little bit of a potential effect. But the effect should be really minor, because most of the different ones are allowed to appear a fair number of times. I'm just not sure that anything really should be doing that. But that said, there's always the possibility that something's going wrong with the random numbers and the way that we do the spawn weights. But they should all be thrown into one big bucket, and then it just pulls from that bucket to decide which one to use. So we may have to look at it further. But every time I've run an experiment, they've looked pretty randomly spread despite the order coming out that way. So if it is having an effect, it must have something to do specifically with what hexes aren't being cleared each day, as opposed to which hexes are.
So I can give you a little fun, and we'll just use this as a discussion. The university's been clearing out 2 monster hexes near us pretty regularly. Only once has it spawned as tier 2. It's all been tier 1. I wonder if those 2 hexes, just for example, are, numbers 29 and 30 on the list, and the tier 2s are already filled up elsewhere. Is that possible?
Well, if there's a bug in the random, yes. But the way the random stuff should be operating, yes, the other hex, I think, if I'm correct, that you guys are pretty far back in the order of the way that it sorts these. However, the odds of the tier 2 escalations being launched in the previous hexes should be super low. So it shouldn't matter what the order is. With the exception that there's probably a fair number of the tier 2 escalations that have home hexes, and that does take up one of the slots for each of those escalations. And most of the home hexes would have been processed before those monster hexes, so that might be a small effect. The far more likely explanation is a sort of a more random one of the fact that the T2 escalations, once they land somewhere else, they're maybe just not being dealt with. And in particular, if some of those T2 escalations are off on parts of the map where no one's playing against them, they'll just sit there and they take up one of the slots for that escalation. And so it's possible the T2 ones just aren't landing as much these days. They may have kind of settled in.
It's worth us trying to figure out, because I think I'm not sure I follow 100%, because I think a lot of the areas that are, either bandit infested and nobody wants to go clear out that escalation, or whatever, after everybody's kind of been done getting their victory markers, I wonder if those other areas are just full of tier 1 garbage, or is it are they all hiding out in the southwest somewhere?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I haven't done a tour lately to see, and we don't. Right now, we don't get a log that says anything like how long something's been there or anything like that. Hopefully, we'll get those logging kind of things as we go along. But yeah, those are the only things I can really think of that would really affect it at this point. Though like I said, I do admit that the home hexes may be eating them up for you. And again, the same thing is the case. If we get that downtime thing fixed somewhere in here, that should help with that, because then when a T2 escalation is cleared, it won't land back in that one hex again as quickly, which should help potentially shove them back towards areas of the map that are being cleared more regularly.
So what do you think about the speed of clearing? I mean, ahead of what you expected? I mean, there's a lot of activity around the victory markers and clearing things out.
I would say overall that it's actually faster than I predicted, although some of that is that originally we've been planning on making these something that would take, that all of them took like a week to clear. But at the same time, we'd also been planning that the world wasn't necessarily, not nearly as many hexes were infected at a time. And then we kind of shifted more towards, we should make it so that players, feel some sense of closure in a much faster time period. And maybe more of the hexes should be infected at any given time, so that whenever you log on, it's pretty likely that at least one of the monster hexes near you has something going on, so you can go do some events and stuff like that. So we're trying to hit that balance. But I guess I've been a little surprised at just how quickly in the heavily populated areas that, an escalation can pop up and then it's just gone within a short period of time. My hope is that if we can get this reverse strength thing working, that will both make the escalations last a little bit longer, but also be more interesting for players when they occur.
I think that's fair. So what do we got coming, Bob? What's the future looking like?
Well, I know that we're talking a lot about getting some more polish in at this point. It's beginning to seem a lot like it's time to take a look at cleaning up some of the things that are causing the most aggravation for players, as opposed to worrying as much about bigger features. So we're going to be focusing a fair amount of attention on that. We have a larger, more global escalation event coming that we've all been talking about. Not quite sure exactly when that'll fit into the schedule. I don't want to give away too much about that, but bad things will happen. And other than that, we've also got some plans for a few additional escalations coming up. I may actually talk about one of those at PaizoCon. That's a thing that I'm supposed to be talking about, escalations, and reiterating how those work for people who appear there. yeah, that's kind of what's on the horizon.
And Matt had a great question about kind of the are we going to see Are we going to see elementals outside of the escalations, just kind of wandering around?
Oh yeah, that's actually one of the other big changes for EE8. In the previous versions, most of the wilderness hexes were set up so that the hex has a kind of like a dominant group of people. The woodlands would be bandits with wolves. The croplands, I think, were just bandits. Swampy areas would be goblins. Mountains or ogres. And whatever that dominant force was, they made up somewhere on the order of 70 to 75% of the encounters that you'd run into. And the remainder of the encounters were just kind of a mix of a small number of skeletons and then some of the other things that you might run into in the other hexes, like ogres and goblins and bandits. And so it was just set up that way. I've gone through, and for the uneven encounters now, it's more like 60% will be the dominant monsters, and the remaining 40% is made up of everything else that you could have run into throughout the world. So you're going to run into Moloch cultists, you're going to run into goblin ghouls, you're going to run into various elementals. You probably won't run into the largest elementals unless you go to the elemental rifts, infected hexes, and beat them down to the point that they start sending out their toughest people. Well, not people, their toughest elementals. But you will see a much wider variety now than you did before.
Any word on when monsters will actually move around and like chase, the wander things?
Sadly, no. It's certainly very, very high on my list of requests, but it's not actually on a schedule anywhere yet.
Great. So any other questions for Bob? You can throw them in the mumble. Actually, we can open up the chat to the room if that's okay with you, Bob, and have a little more free-for-all.
Sounds good.
All right. So open to the room. What questions do you have for Bob?
I think everyone's stone quiet deciding on the best question to ask.
Fair enough.
So Fannis asked a question about what about big bad like Goblin Works, GM-led monsters and monster events?
So yeah, that's something that's definitely come up. Is talk about how we might do some things where the GMs get in and have some monsters, have some suits that we can wear that basically let us go around and do things. We've talked about potentially doing that with this more global escalation that we're working on, which will be more of a special event than an escalation that you'll necessarily see repeatedly throughout the world. So yeah, we've talked about that, and of course there's been the talk of potentially having monster casting eventually for some of the players, and we keep bringing out a lot of those ideas back and talking about them. A lot of it just comes down to what we can find, what we can get done in time. At least with the GM-led stuff, that's a relatively straightforward thing for some of us to do.
So sometime soon?
I'm actually hoping that it'll be part of that global event. We'll see.
That sounds like fun. Oh, yeah, everybody wants dragons, griffins, and flying things.
Yeah, that's going to be further out, that's sure. I suspect we'll probably start tackling that and formations and larger things, as the population hits the point where we really have to. When there's just way too many people for us to have people keep going at just other, human-sized monsters and stuff like that. But yeah, that's definitely on the way out part of the schedule.
This is Wesley. I just had a question about general monster AI and some of your long-term goals. As is right now, I'm sure you have a lot of things in the works. So so we'll limit this to mainly the aggro system and monsters general aggro. How do you see that going long term, or is it actually working as intended currently?
So, in a sense, it's working as intended, but only in the sense that it's the short term. We didn't intend to put too much work into the AI, at the initial level. The thought was that the monsters are supposed to essentially be slightly challenging gathering nodes at this point. So we didn't want to put too much effort into the AI. But in the long term, yeah, we definitely want to make it so that they do a lot more intelligent stuff. We've already made some minor changes, in particular with the issue before where all the monsters would attack one person. And now we've got it so they attack the entire party. We're talking about changing that around so that they just attack everybody nearby instead of everybody in the party. We have some oddities when they attack everybody in the party. We've gone out adventuring, and one of us will just be a gatherer, and they're off gathering happily off in the distance, not paying any attention, and then the rest of us will go attack somebody, and like two of the monsters will peel off and run a huge distance away to go attack the gatherer, who has no idea that that's happening. So we're hoping to improve on that. There's supposed to be a lot of things in the system there where the monsters are supposed to be paying a lot of attention to, who's doing them damage, who's capable of doing them damage, who they're managing to do damage against, a lot of those kinds of things. And some of them just don't seem to be working the way that we'd hoped they would. So we'll probably tweak with those and fiddle with those. But definitely we want to improve it over time so that the monsters are offering much more of an interesting encounter for everybody who's up against them. It's just one of those things that we look at right now and go, yeah, we'd like to improve that, but we really need to get to the point that you guys can be, creating your settlements and really having that settlement to settlement warfare going on before we can worry too much about how that side of fighting monsters is going.
Sure. Great answer. Completely understand the priority list. Short little follow-up. How about a potential in the short term, some secondary effects that aren't really actually taking effect on monsters so much? Is there an estimated timeline on that fix going in?
I'm actually not sure. I suspect some of that. I don't know how much of that is bugs and how much of that is not implementing some of these kinds of things. I'd have to ask around about that. I don't think it's actually on the schedule to be fixed at this point. But it definitely goes against one of our main tenets of fighting things, which is to try not to be teaching a lot of the wrong lessons when you're playing PvE. I mean, obviously when you're going up against creatures. Excuse me. When you're going up against things, you can. Sorry.
We'll give you a minute, Bob. Don't worry.
Sorry, I had a sore throat. My daughter's had a sore throat for the last couple of weeks, and apparently I'm having trouble fighting it off. We don't want you to be learning those kinds of lessons, but obviously in a situation where you can go up against monsters and kite them and do that kind of stuff, it's already some unfortunate lessons. But we certainly don't want too much, you totally have to outfit differently against monsters than against players, or that skills you can use against players you totally can't use against monsters and stuff like that. So it's definitely on the list of things we'd like to get fixed. But I'm not sure that it's fallen very high. I suspect it's one of those problems where fixing it is more difficult than the reward for getting it fixed. But I'm not sure about that.
Okay, thank you.
Oh, I had another question, Bob, that Blood asked about. Something about ruins, hexes, and those making escalations harder. Is that the case?
So there's nothing in the escalation spreadsheets that makes escalations harder anywhere than they are in any other place. The one thing that does affect how difficult an escalation might feel in a certain hex is that how many encounters are launched in a particular hex is set by the type of hex that it is. So the number of 30-meter encounters that it tries to launch in a standard wilderness hex may be only 4, but then when you're in a monster hex or a Badlands hex or a home hex, maybe more like 6. So you would find that the encounters are basically denser in those hexes. Now, the flip side is that right now, that might not actually make it harder. That might actually make it easier because it's easier to find enemies to kill. Likewise, it could turn out that although the monster hexes are trying to launch more encounters, because they have so many elevation changes, they have fewer places to put them, and those places can be harder to get to. So that might make it harder in some of the areas to deal with them. They don't do anything, though, like launch tougher monsters or anything along those lines. It's really just the density of monsters. And like I said, right now, density of monsters may not have that much of an effect on people because, you can still kind of zigzag your way around them and avoid them for the most part. Later, when we start adding in, monsters having a little more mobility, or if we add in some stuff where, fighting with one encounter may attract nearby encounters, like if we have some kind of a noise system so that if you do things that make noise, it attracts attention, any of those kinds of things, that'll make it so that fighting in a densely populated area is much more risky than fighting in a lightly populated area.
I think the theory on the ruins hexes, there was an old map that had some hexes marked as ruins, and the belief is that escalations spread faster in those, or spawn faster, or grow faster.
Yeah, I don't think they do. There are some hexes that are marked as, I think they're the ones we call Badlands hexes, and they usually appear near monster hexes. And those ones are definitely set to launch a larger number of creatures, but I don't think there's any kind of multipliers on how quickly they get reinforced or do anything like that, at least none that I'm aware of.
Okay. Other questions, Bob? So, Fannis had a question about named place on the larger map and the smaller place.
Sorry, I got cut off for a second there.
The question Fannis was having was about monster hexes, escalations, other things that are named, and being monster homes and things like that.
Oh, getting names on the larger... Yeah, we've actually been talking about doing that.
And Tagari wants to know, when can we actually assist escalations?
So, I believe factions are sort of on the further in part of the schedule is probably the best I can really say at this point. They're definitely high on our priority list of something to add in. And once we have those, we should be able to... Part of getting factions to feel meaningful is being able to turn stuff in and do things like that. So a lot of those things kind of go together. If we reach the point where people can, turn weapons into the Aspis Consortium or something like that, then that also gets us really close to the possibility of having events occur in an escalation where you can where you can drop off weapons to make the goblins stronger, or potentially where you can drop off ingredients so that people can make antibiotics essentially for plague victims or do things like that. It also gets us to the point where we start having the ability to say this particular event is restricted to people who have a certain degree of faction points with some particular group. So you might not get offered the opportunity to help out the Bone Dancers unless you've done some other quests or something like get some status with them in the first place. So once we start getting that kind of thing, hopefully we can start talking about adding that to the escalations as well.
Very cool. If you have one or two last questions for Bob, and then we'll let him go so you can actually get some sleep and not get this sore throat. Love to open up to the group. So the question is about alignment of escalations: good, neutral, evil.
So right now there's we don't have anything set on them that says what alignment they are. That's obviously not too hard to add something that would do that. But yeah, that goes along with the whole faction idea, is that we would want to have it so that, you know, if you're evil, you don't run around attacking some of these escalations. And then once we actually have some of that in, it might even reach the point where, you know, if you're evil and you've gained faction points of evil of some kind, or however that works, that when you enter maybe a Bone Dancer hex, that they don't initially look at you badly, so they wouldn't necessarily attack you right away. And events would come up that would offer you the opportunity to do something about it. Similarly, we could have good aligned ones where, like I said, with the plague victims or something like that, that they wouldn't attack people or do anything along those lines. And all of the actions you could do would be to give them things that help them out. And if you do so, that would prove your goodness and so forth. But likewise, if you're, you know, chaotic evil or something, and you go in and give them stuff to help them out, that might count against you, or make you less evil, or give you, or take away your faction's points with your gods who are evil and stuff like that. So all of that is kind of waiting on this whole faction system to give that meaning.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Bob. We appreciate having you. Any last thoughts?
No, just thanks again for everybody coming on and listening to me ramble, and appreciate all the feedback. We really do try to get as much of that stuff put in as we can each time we put out another patch.
Great. And Lisa, who are we going to have for next week?
Wasn't ready for that. I'm thinking, I don't know. Maybe Steven. I'll ask Steven. I think it might be his turn. I'll get back to you.
The other thing that might be interesting is we haven't had anyone from kind of the server side, or, you know, the infamous Richter and some of those others that we haven't actually talked to.
Yeah, I don't know if you want to talk to Richter. Mark's mostly the server guy, so when Mark comes here, there's a lot of talk about server stuff, I think. But you know, I can ask Richter, but I'm not sure what you'd ask him. It might be interesting. I'll talk amongst. I'll talk to those guys and see what they say.
Have you met the people in here? Man, we can get a conversation out of anybody. Yeah, let the secrets out. I love that. Well, thank you very much, everybody. Appreciate it, and we'll get back to you on what the next Keepside Chat is. Make yourself at home. Feel free to use the channel to chat.